Hey, you guys, welcome to History of Thought 2, and today we're going to talk about Franz Fanon and Black existentialism. So, I am going to introduce a term here at the beginning, post-colonialism, which is a body of theory that arose sort of in the middle of 20th century that analyzes and responds to the cultural legacy of Western colonialism and imperialism. We often kind of ask, where is knowledge about the non-West typically generated? Who produces it and for what purposes? Typically the answer would be, from Europeans, from white people. That was sort of the whole enterprise of colonialism. Imperialism also produced this whole body of knowledge about what the Middle East was like, what Africa was like, what Asia was like, and what these cultures were like. And that's actually the origin of anthropology, is in imperialist countries attempting to analyze the peoples that they come into contact with. So post-colonialism is a philosophical tradition that's really starts in the second half of the 20th century, that's in with sort of Western philosophy, but it privileges a non-Western perspective. It privileges the perspective of the people who were colonized, who were subjects of imperialism, who were subjects of sort of white supremacy. In the American context, that would be, people of color who were either brought over here forcibly through enslavement, right? The origin of African Americans, or all sorts of other people of color who through migration and other kinds of movements are in sort of the United States. But a lot of European countries, along with the United States, explicitly also had colonies outside of their borders. And so post-colonialism is about sort of dealing with the perspective of the people in those systems of power who are the non-dominant, who are the dominated. So it's questioning dominant Western ways of seeing and theorizing from the perspective of the colonized, of people of color. And it's also concerned with how power structures are imposed by the West and maintained, both during and after colonialism, right? So post-colonialism, neo-colonialism, global systems of white supremacy. So we're talking about existentialism and colonialism today. So there's this kind of ambiguous relationship with the Enlightenment and with sort of the Western canon of philosophy that we've been looking at and reading in this class, that many post-colonial thinkers are influenced and read and highly sort of regard Western philosophy. Kant, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, existentialism. I mean, especially Marx is incredibly appealing to a lot of people, that have been oppressed. But it's also very critical of sort of the clear whiteness of this Western intellectual tradition. And so the broad appeals of equality and progress in the Enlightenment, that can be very appealing, the sort of abstract nature of these Enlightenment ideas, versus the lived reality of the application of these ideas on marginalized people. So that central paradox of the Enlightenment, right, the sort of American version is, how is it that so many of our founding fathers were espousing these great ideas about equality, but they also, had slaves? But there's a larger paradox in Western history, about how is it that a lot of these Enlightenment ideas coming out of European traditions about universal human freedom and progress and rationality are happening at the same time that many of these countries are rapidly expanding their colonial empire and engaging in imperialist activities against non-white people all over the world. And they're happening at the same time. So that's kind of the context of Franz Fanon. Another aspect of Franz Fanon's context is a movement called Black existentialism. So Black existentialism is a label applied to a set of African and African diaspora identified philosophers, notably writing mostly in the middle of the 20th century. And they all share a similar concern with the existentialists such as Sartre and de Beauvoir, such as the philosophical implications of human existence and consciousness. But specifically what they're looking at is the psychological effects of colonialism and colonial violence, white supremacy, as well as projects of projects that try to make radical human freedom possible within these structures of colonialism and white supremacy. So, while most existentialist thought by white thinkers is predicated on the uniqueness of the individual, as well as on universal conceptions of humans and their obligation to the self, Black existential philosophy is predication on the liberation of all Black people in the world from oppression. I mean, there's a little bit here. I mean, I think de Beauvoir and sort of her notion of sort of our connectivity to one another and the ethics of ambiguity and the fact that we can't realize our own freedom without sort of realizing the freedom of others. Right? She's a little bit different than other existentialist thinkers here, but a lot of the Black existentialists are thinking along the same lines in terms of that this isn't just about like sort of individual freedom, but it is inherently a collectivist sort of project in terms of freedom. So what is it? What would the liberation of all people of color across the world, what would that look like? And from an existentialist project. So the prominent thinkers in Black existentialism, we talk some about, we read W.B. Du Bois in this class, who's often associated with Marxism, but he's sometimes connected to Black existentialism. Ralph Ellison, an American writer, Aimé Césaire, a famous sort of Francophone African philosopher, Franz Fanon, who we're talking about today, perhaps James Baldwin, who we'll talk about in a future week. And remember what de Beauvoir said: our ability to realize our own freedom is predicated upon the freedom of all other individuals, and this is central to Black existentialism as well. So very briefly, kind of a historical context of post-colonialism and Black existentialism. I'm going to show you some maps, right? So, Western colonialism and imperialism had been going on for a very long time. We can trace it back to the 1500s with the voyages of exploration and, initial European colonies, not only in the Americas, but as sort of European explorers are rounding kind of the Africa into the Indian Ocean. They're starting to set up trading posts and then small sort of colonies. But it's really kind of in the 1700s and definitely in the 1800s with the scramble for Africa that Europeans are sort of amassing these giant colonial empires. And so this slide shows you the world in 1914, and you can kind of see how by this time, obviously, the Americas, which had been previous colonies of mostly Britain and Spain, but also Portugal and France, mostly all of those states had gained freedom, but that, the rest of the Eastern Hemisphere, large portions of South Asia and, of course, the Pacific Islands and South Asia and the Middle East and the entire continent of Africa almost are all kind of victims of European expansion through colonialism and imperialism, so that by 1914 you have a significant part of the globe which is under domination by European powers. So 1914 is the year World War I starts, and of course, if you look at this map, you can see why it's a global war. So by kind of the middle of the century, so by the point that Franz Fanon is writing, so we're kind of looking at this point in the 1950s and the 1960s, you have what's called decolonization. And so that you have a number of countries, or of colonized areas by European powers on the continent of Africa, in the Middle East, in South Asia, and in Southeast Asia that are gaining independence. And this is a huge movement that takes place for a couple decades after World War II, with the creation of a significant number of new states in the world through decolonization and independence for these countries. So this is kind of this context that Fanon is writing in. And also, too, this is a map of the Caribbean. And, so this is a map of the Caribbean. And, the Caribbean, even though small in area, was an incredibly important part of the world for European powers during sort of the colonial era because of sugar plantations. Haiti itself was, during the height of sugar production in Haiti, which is sort of the left half of the island of Hispaniola, and it mostly belonged to the French, and I think it produced like a quarter of all wealth for the French Empire, in the mid to late 1700s. Franz Fanon was from the island of Martinique, which you can see is sort of highlighted in red in the lower right-hand corner of this map, and it was a French colony. But a lot of these islands, a lot of these now countries in the Caribbean were mostly British or French colonies, and highly productive colonies, and also because of sugar plantations. And of course that meant that a lot of slaves were involuntarily transported to the Caribbean. And so these were all slaves in societies where Africans were enslaved, and enslaved Africans were brought. And that becomes sort of important to Franz Fanon's story. Oh, I already talked about that one. So actually, I'll go back to this one. That's right. So if you think about last time when we talked about de Beauvoir and this sort of self-other dichotomy, that kind of man or male or masculinity is the self, it defines this other, this object, female, woman, feminine, and sort of sees that as sort of what it is not, and defines itself, which is sort of the man, as sort of the normal, the unmarked, the sort of standard, and the female as sort of the marked other, and defines sort of the female as everything it is not. That kind of dualistic identity also we can apply in sort of a racial dimension to Western views of others, right? So white versus black, civilized versus savage, European versus barbarian, right? All of these kinds of divisions are about Westerners really constructing their own identity. Well, what's civilized, right? Well, it's not, civilized is not this. What's sort of white culture? Well, it's not black culture, right? It's not all of these cultures that we've been encountering, right? So there's this sort of Westerners sort of defining who they are through sort of their juxtaposition against these others. One famous theorist of postcolonialism said, when Western people look at the non-Western world, what they see is often more of a mirror image of themselves and their own assumptions than the reality of what is really there. And this is something that it's important to kind of discuss in class context. So we'll come back to this. So Franz Fanon, who you read for today, born in 1829, died in 1961. So he was only 36 when he died of leukemia. He actually was in Maryland when he died. But he was trained as a psychiatrist, philosopher, and political activist, and he was influenced by Marx, Freud, and Sartre. So he read a lot of the same stuff you guys have been reading this semester. So he was born in the French Caribbean colony of Martinique. And what's interesting about Martinique is that it's still not an independent country. It's still what is called I forget, what do the French call it? A protectorate. It's like an overseas territory. So it's still technically part of France. So he was born to an upper middle class Creole family. So that was a family that would have been from mixed ancestry. So mixed Afro-Caribbean and European descent. So, he had both sort of European ancestors as well as enslaved African ancestors. He was actually the darkest skinned person in a light skinned family, which definitely affected him. And he talks a lot about how that affected him, because of the colorism within his family. Light skin was valued more, right? Especially because they're a mixed family. He was educated in French schools in Martinique. He fought in the French army during World War II and therefore stayed in France and trained and worked as a psychiatrist. And he worked and traveled extensively in French-controlled Africa, North America, Asia, and Europe. And his ideas and writings significantly influenced anti-colonial movements across the globe. So he becomes, he's trained as a psychiatrist, but he really becomes a anti-colonial and sort of pro-independence activist and travels all over, not just sort of the Francophone colonial world, but everywhere sort of as this activist and this famous writer. He wrote another kind of famous book about, when violence is sort of justified in fighting colonialism, which is something that he was quite known for. But black skin, white mask is more kind of the psychological more psychological of his work. So what he's trying to do in Black Skin, White Masks is examine this central question. What are the psychological effects of systems of Western colonialism and imperialism on the colonized? So he's trying to look at sort of how colonized peoples internalize a lot of these discourses about white supremacy and about cultural inferiority and what that actually does to them. Now, if we're having a live class, this is normally the time when I show about the first 20 minutes of the documentary on Franz Fanon. I didn't assign this, but it is highly recommended if you look at this week's sort of required readings. And I do have a free copy available for download, so I would highly recommend that you watch it. At least watch like the first 22 minutes. It was made in the 90s, but it's excellent, and it's called Black Skin, White Masks. Black Skin, White Masks, and it really gives you a great introduction to Franz Fanon and sort of his arguments if you'd rather just watch a documentary about it instead of, listening to me. But at least, watch the first 22 minutes, which talks a little bit about his background, but it also talks about the incident that sort of propelled him to write the book and the incident that begins the chapter that you are assigned, which is a chapter from Black Skin, White Mask called The Fact of Blackness. So in all of Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon is, I will switch the slide, examining the effects of cultural assimilation that colonized peoples were forced into. So your existing indigenous language or culture, your religion or your spiritual traditions, your way of life are seen as inferior. Colonized peoples are forced to take on the culture of the colonizer. So, when Fanon goes to school and he goes to the best school he can go to, he's learning French language, French history, and French culture in a school in Martinique, right? In the Caribbean. And this is really kind of part of the West civilizing mission. And, what's interesting about this is, the civilizing mission in a lot of ways is kind of part of the Enlightenment. It's this notion of Western peoples sort of uplifting and bringing sort of education and rational thought and enlightenment and culture to the uncivilized peoples that they conquer. So on the one hand, it's this very idealistic, we're spreading the Enlightenment, isn't that great? But it's also incredibly racist, right? And it's also incredibly devaluing of the cultures and the languages and the traditions that people had in the cultures that were colonized, right? But so Fanon is educated in this. And, one of the things that he really sort of recognizes is how early on he bought into it, right? He bought into sort of the superiority of Frenchness. He bought into sort of the superiority of the colonizing culture. When he was educated at French schools in Martinique, when he went to France to sort of become a psychologist, he bought into it. He was the good colonial subject. And Fanon calls this the colonial self or the depersonalized self. And that is sort of the self that a lot of people in colonized nations sort of take on, right? They sort of, I should say drink the Kool-Aid, but this is also something that's been violently imposed on them too, right? So, you think of kind of like the constraints that one is under to sort of accept French culture, right? I mean, to get a good education, he has to, and he's completely absorbed in this context where French culture is superior, and it's more liberating, and it's more freedom loving, and it's more sort of civilized, and it's more advanced, and it's more rational purportedly. And also remember too, he's, at the time, which would have been called Creole, right? He's partly of ancestry-wise European culture. He's partly of African diaspora, right? So there's a lot of complicated identity politics going on here. So Fanon is really influenced by Freud and how the very desires of colonized people have been transformed. A desire for whiteness, a desire without fully being able to achieve that desire, right? A desire to sort of be that self, right? To be that European or Western self, even though they are seen as the other by that self. But they're never really able fully take a part in that. Even though Fanon is being educated in French schools and going to France, we're going to look at this incident where it kind of his whole sort of colonial self or depersonalized self gets shattered. That it's this kind of schizophrenia, right? It's black skins, white masks. What does it mean to have that white mask on? I mean, what does it mean at the point that you realize that you have a white mask on? And it's schizophrenic because the sort of colonized people, even though they're encouraged to sort of take on the culture of the colonized, take on the language of the colonized, take on the values of the colonized, they're never really fully accepted by the colonizer. It's a imitation. In the eyes, in sort of the eyes of Westerners of European descent, colonial peoples can never really fully be European. They're really only second-rate copies, no matter how hard they try. But it's still better than their original culture in the eyes of the colonizer, and in terms of what many of the colonized have internalized. So, what happens when Fanon sort of this colonial self gets shattered? And that's really what this chapter is about that I've assigned you guys. And so I'm going to read, because I do this in class, I read a little bit of it. So I'm going to read a little excerpt from the first few pages. I'm going to skip some. I'm not going to read everything. But what happens when Fanon goes to France? He goes to France to fight in World War II, but he stays and he sort of goes to medical school. He becomes a psychiatrist. So what happens? So there's kind of this, the context is, you don't really get this from the book. If you watch the film, you do. But he's on a train. And he's been in France for a while. And he's a black guy in France. And I mean, it's not like super unusual to be a black guy in France at this point. I mean, there's a much larger black community now in a place like Paris. But it's not like somebody on a train in France would have never seen a dark-skinned person. But it's certainly somewhat unusual, right? So what happens is a little girl says, "Look, a Negro." He says, "I came into the world imbued with the will to find a meaning in things, my spirit filled with the desire to attain to the source of the world. And then I found that I was an object in the midst of other objects. Sealed in that crushing objecthood, I turned beseechingly to others. Their attention was a liberation running over my body, suddenly abraded into non-being, endowing me once again with an agility that I thought I had lost, and by taking me out of the world, restoring me to it. But just as I reached the other side, I stumbled, and the movements, the attitude, the glances of the other fixed me there, in the sense in which I was a chemical solution. The chemical solution is fixed by a dye. I was indignant. I demanded an explanation. Nothing happened. I burst apart. Now the fragments have been put together again by another self. As long as the black man is among his own, he will have no occasion, except in minor internal conflicts, to experience his being through others." Skipping ahead a little bit. The black man among his own in the 20th century does not know at what moment his inferiority comes into being through the other. Of course, I have talked about the black problem with friends, or more rarely with American Negroes. Together we protested, we asserted the equality of all men in the world. And then the occasion arose when I had to meet the white man's eyes. An unfamiliar weight burdened me. The real world challenged my claims. In the white world, the man of color encounters difficulties in the development of his bodily schema. Consciousness of the body is solely a negative activity. It is a third-person consciousness. The body is surrounded by an atmosphere of certain uncertainty. Okay, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. Look, a Negro. It was an external stimulus that flicked over me as I passed by. I made a tight smile. Look, a Negro. It was true. It amused me. Look, a Negro. The circle was drawing a bit tighter. I made no secret of my amusement. Mama, see the Negro. I'm frightened, frightened, frightened. Now they were beginning to be afraid of me. I made up my mind to laugh myself to tears, but laughter became impossible. I could no longer laugh because I already knew that there were legends, stories, history, above all, historicity, which I had learned from Then, assailed at various points, the corporeal schema crumbled, its place taken by a racial epidermal schema. In the train, it was no longer a question of being aware of my body in the third person, but in a triple person. In the train, I was given not one, two, three places. I had already stopped being amused. It was not that I was finding febrile coordinates in the world. I existed triply. I occupied space. I moved towards the other, and the effervescent other, hostile, but not opaque, transparent, not there, disappeared. Nausea. I was responsible at the same time for my body, my race, my ancestors. I subjected myself to objective examination. I discovered my blackness, my ethnic characteristics, and I was battered down by tom-toms, cannibalism, intellectual deficiency, fetishism, racial defects, slave ships, and above all, sure good eating. So what's going on there? What's the meaning of this look of Negro incident? What is happening with Fanon's personal experience on a train, and what is it saying about this larger psychological effect of colonialism? It's really this moment where the colonized self, the white mask, becomes fractured. And he uses the word nausea, in existentialism, that moment when you sort of recognize that all of the things about the world that you thought were fixed, were essential, where that's the way it is, when all of that sort of veneer just falls away. And you see how crazy and strange the world is and messed up it is, and how it doesn't have to be that way, and how all of that which you assume is the way it is not. Existence precedes essence. He's weeping at the end because of this existentialist ambiguity. There isn't a resolution, there isn't a answer. All of a sudden he realizes what he is through the eyes of white people, and all of the stereotypes and all of the baggage about sort of blackness and Africanness that comes with it, and how that is all he is in their eyes, that colonial self is falling away, and he realizes that it is false, that it is not essential, that it is not something that is just the way it is. And he sees sort of the facticity of how he really looks as an object in the eyes of that little girl and her mother. The colonialism and continued racism after colonialism that he's experiencing makes the colonized take on a fractured identity. You're part of the West, you're part of your own culture, but you're not fully either. And especially for a lot of people who are multiracial, like Fanon, right? It complicates it even more. I mean, it wasn't like there was some sort of essential Afro-Caribbean culture that he was a part of before the colonizers came. I mean, the only reason that he's there was because of the slave trade and because of bringing enslaved Africans over. So, it's not like there's some sort of essential culture that he's stripping away the whiteness to find underneath, right? But he also is living in a culture where he's constantly consuming negative images and stereotypes of blackness, and this creates psychological trauma for people of color in that culture. It leads to this alienated sense of self, and alienated sort of in a psychological sense, not really a Marxist sense. So that in Western cultures, people of color are often objects. There's these already predefined conceptions of blackness that enter into any interactions with other people. And that this is kind of like W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness, that you must always, if you're sort of, a racial other, that you must always see yourself simultaneously through your own eyes, but through the eyes of whiteness. That you're never able to be an individual self-defined subject fully. You're always also an object. And the existentialist connection here is that racism inhibits true freedom for people of color. It's not just sort of it's not just structural racism, but it's also internally, psychologically, in terms of this individual psychology. So how to reclaim your subjecthood as a person of color, right? So Fanon, in the end, Fanon also kind of rejects a lot of, and this isn't of cultural and political movements that celebrate blackness in African cultures in the mid-20th century. There's all of these movements, they're often called negritude movements. And, he kind of rejects them because I think he's also rejecting kind of a black essence as well. And so there can be sort of a strategic essentialism, right? There can be a strategic essentialism in saying, all Black people are sort of repressed, and therefore we have to have a movement around that repression. Absolutely. You see the same thing in the women's move, in movements for women's rights, for LGBTQ rights, that sort of thing. But there's kind of this assumed essentialism that experience is all the same. Is there a Black essence? No. Right? Is there a queer essence? No. Is there a female essence? No. Right? But politically, sometimes acting as if that's true can help gain rights. But ultimately, even kind of Fanon is rejecting that. Right? So in The Fact of Blackness, Fanon states, for not only must the Black man be Black, he must be Black in relation to the white man. Some critics will take it on themselves to remind us that this position has a converse. I say this is false. The Black man has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man. And we can talk more about what that means in class. So this is really, this is mostly about kind of the psychology of racism for Blacks. And what does it mean to both kind of shatter this colonial self, shatter that sort of essentialist view that has had people, marginalized peoples in colonial contexts, sort of internalize a lot of the internalize a lot of the sort of, the colonial culture is superior, right? As Fanon did. And we're seeing this moment where that shatters. But what replaces it? And for Fanon, there isn't some sort of Black essence. I'm realizing sort of my true essence. But it's also factual, and also the material factual, that people of color have been marginalized and repressed and colonized. And so you can create movements of freedom around that while also recognizing that existence precedes essence, both in terms of race as well as de Beauvoir said, in terms of gender. We can talk more about this in class. This is a lot to sort of unpack, but this is really what Fanon is saying. I mean, he's also like a giant anti-colonial activist too. So he's recognizing that putting his words into action is important. Fanon is also talking some about the psychology of racism for whites, though, here, and that self-other dichotomy, right? That the self, and in this sense, the self is sort of the white self, has defined themselves through what they are not, right? And what they are not are all of the sort of negative things that are associated with Black or racial others or colonized peoples. So this desire for the other must be shut down through the denial of their full subjecthood. So, a lot of times, and we'll be talking about this more when we talk about Said, that, sometimes kind of defining something as an object and saying, that's not me, inherent in that is maybe actually a real kind of desiring for that other or some characteristics of the other. So white people do not undergo the same psychological fracturing as people of color in Western cultures, at least in terms of race, right? I mean, we can understand maybe different sort of processes going along in terms of gender or gender identity or sexual orientation or those sorts of things. White people do not need to simultaneously see themselves through their own eyes and through the eyes of other people of color in order to live their daily lives psychologically, right? But Fanon is saying, right, there isn't this double consciousness, but Fanon is saying also that, there is a lot of psychological damage going on also for those who are defining themselves as the self, right, for white people as well. So he's also kind of exploring that. It's not the same way and it's not as bad, right? But there's still an essentialism on sort of the powerful end of this dichotomy on the white end that needs to be broken down as well. And sort of thinking through what is that desire for the other about. And so the psychology, hold on just a second. Okay. So, we can really see that the importance of the structural power of whiteness going on here is also what Fanon and others like him want us to look at. Right? That this isn't about some sort of essentialist difference between different cultures, obviously, and some cultures sort of in an essentialist sense being superior or inferior, but it's really about the structural power of whiteness as an idea, the structural power of whiteness to define who is self and who is the object, who gets to sort of engage more easily in these projects of freedom, and who is sort of constrained by these structures of whiteness and all of the stereotypes that come along with them, who sort of internalizes the negative stereotypes, which therefore inherently limits people's freedom to be able to sort of be truly and radically free in an existentialist sense. So even if there is no essence to whiteness, even though there's no essence to blackness, this doesn't mean that it's like, oh, race is a construct, we're all free now, right? That there's still an important material, structural power of all of these things in our lives, psychologically, and also sort of materially constraining what we can or can't do. And breaking down those systems of white supremacy and racism, right, is what is needed for Fanon, for people in an existentialist sense, all people, to truly sort of recognize and realize their freedom. And of course, just like de Beauvoir, for Black existentialists, you can't separate the freedom of one individual from all individuals. Absolutely. It's all interconnected. And I think one thing that we can talk about, and especially in terms of the psychological effects of racism and white supremacy on subordinate peoples, is Fanon wrote this in the 1950s in the context of sort of these decolonization and these independence movements around the world by former colonized peoples. Do you think his ideas still apply today? Is it still relevant today, and why? See you next time.